Welcome to the panel on neurodiversity and mental illnesses. Could you introduce yourselves and, if you're comfortable talking about it, telling us what's your personal experience with neurodiversity and our mental illnesses?
I'm Corinne Davis. I'm the author of Otherbound, a young adult fantasy novel that came out in 2014, and On the Edge of Gone, a young adult sci-fi novel that came out this March. And this one is relevant to the chat because it has an autistic protagonist. So I'm a young adult author published with Abrams Books, and my personal experience includes mental illness since I was pretty young, mainly depression and anxiety. And I was diagnosed with autism when I was 14 and with ADD when I was 23. I am also a co-founder and editor of Disability and Kitlet, where we discuss a lot of books falling into this category and talk about the tropes, the stereotypes, and review the books that cover these characters.
Okay. I'm Catherine Locke. I am the author of Second Position, Finding Center, and the upcoming Girl with the Red Balloon. Mine are digital only, so you can have a picture on a phone. This is the one that's on Voices. Allie's experience is closely mirrored online. I was diagnosed pretty late because I was really good at hiding symptoms. So I was diagnosed with depression in college, anxiety out of college, and an eating disorder in college. I'm in recovery for the eating disorder, but depression and anxiety will probably be a lifelong thing for me. And I talk a lot about this online, and I write a lot about this because I can and I know others can't. So I really am a big advocate of trying to reduce the stigma around mental illnesses.
Okay. Hi, I'm Nita. I'm represented by Emily Keys of Fuse Literary. I was diagnosed with situational depression my sophomore year of college, and this past February was diagnosed with generalized anxiety, which I'm on meds for. I kind of, like Katie, hid my symptoms a lot growing up. I knew I had anxiety in high school, but never really talked about it. So actually being diagnosed and getting on medication was really helpful. I semi-address this in my books. I haven't written a book yet with a character who has generalized anxiety like I do, mostly because I just now realized I have generalized anxiety. So I'm sure that will come later down the road. I do talk a lot about my mental illness on Twitter and about starting medication and about my experiences on medication because, like Katie said, a lot of people can't or don't talk about it, so I also want to reduce the stigma, especially around mental illness medication.
What do you think are some overdone tropes or misconceptions you wish would disappear from fiction?
I'm just going to copy my response from yesterday's disability chat, which is I have been running Disability and Kitlet for 3 years and I'm not done talking about this, so there's absolutely no way I can answer this briefly. I'm going to focus mainly on autism here. That is the big problem, that it's almost always written from an outside perspective, and it's almost always done in a very superficial and stereotyped way that also manages to reinforce a lot of issues, like the belief that autistic people don't have empathy, don't care about other people, and lots of other stuff. That for me is a very big one, and others that, like, when you see depression or anxiety, it's usually in a very like it's done in a way that it's a large part of the story. You don't often see characters just living and managing their mental illness, and you also don't often see milder cases of it. Which can be a problem if you do have a milder case, because you will automatically assume, well, hey, depression is this big thing where it takes over your entire life and you want to kill yourself. And that is, for a lot of people, that is the case, and for a lot of people it isn't. So we just need a lot more variety in how it's presented, I think. Those are a couple of the big ones I can go on, but I think Katie and Anita will have a lot of interesting ones as well, so I don't want to steal their examples.
Yeah, so some of that overlaps with the disability panel that Corinne and I were on yesterday. The one that drives me the craziest, using the word crazy, which I should not be using. The one that bothers me the most is the idea that mental illnesses are easily cured and that they're cured through love. Personal experience, not true. It would be great if it was, but that's not accurate, and it's a really dangerous myth on both sides. One, somebody's putting a lot of pressure on a relationship to fix them because there's a perception that there's something broken about you, and that idea is really common in books with mental illness, that being depressed or being anxious or having bipolar disorder or anything along those lines means that you are broken and need to be fixed. And that is not true. People are wired differently. You are wired differently. And there are ways to cope with the world when you are wired differently. But it also puts a lot of pressure on the person who is not mentally ill and is the love interest both in real life and in fiction. You can't ask people to be your saviors, and that's a really dangerous thing as well, and it's very hard to put on somebody else. So that really, really bothers me when I read it, and I read it a lot. I read a book that was otherwise great other than the character with an eating disorder falls in love, and her new boyfriend is like, let's go get ice cream, and she's like, you know what, I totally don't have eating disorder thoughts anymore. I love ice cream. Yeah, that's not how it goes. Nita's turn.
Katie and Corinne have both made really good points as well. I think a couple of things I would like to stop seeing anxiety mainly conflated as social anxiety. There are different. My partner has social anxiety and I don't, but like the idea that anxiety automatically means you're awkward around people, or which has not been the case for me personally, which is one of the reasons I also hid my anxiety, because I can like flip that switch and be able to interact well, even though it's really draining for me. I would also personally really like to stop seeing the stigma that medication puts you in a fog or makes you a zombie or any other, or isn't helpful, or like is forced on the character and they hate taking it and then they throw away their meds and suddenly their life is colorful and vibrant, and like that's not I would really like to not see that. And I think actually for me that conception is what kept me from getting medication for so long, because I grew up believing, and my parents also, because of generational differences, believe that medication just puts you in a fog and isn't helpful and doesn't make any difference, or if it does make a difference, it's a bad one. And we really need to stop peddling the idea that it like it sucks all the creativity out of you or it makes you a different person, because that's not true. Like it's to quote next to normal, it's not an exact science. And there's a lot to try. Like you have to continually try different medications to find the right one. It's not always perfect, but it still needs to be addressed that it does help and it can help and it can be very useful.
Yeah, I actually had similar experiences. I was suicidal at a very disturbingly young age, and to be honest, I should have had medication. I should have taken medication at that point, because it was at such a far gone stage that I wasn't really responding to therapy either. And I didn't want it, because at the time I was 14, I think, 13, 14, 15, around that age, and I didn't want medication because I thought it would make me a different person. I thought that I would be constantly second-guessing myself and wondering whether my decisions were me or is this the medication? And it doesn't really work that way. And for some people, there is a fog, and it does change them. But for so many people, it isn't. So the assumption that that's the case is so damaging. And teenagers and everybody, in teenagers in this particular case, do internalize that. And I have been using medication more recently, and hey, shockingly, it did not make me a different person. It just allowed me to be more me without the depression getting in the way. So that's so important. So it's not going to be good for everybody, but people shouldn't dismiss it out of hand based on these ideas. So that is definitely important. And another thing that I wanted to add regarding the it's okay. The other one to add was just that, again, when you see depression or anxiety, it's in fiction, it's usually related to something, or it has an identifiable cause, and in real life, so often that is not the case. So often it just is, and someone can have a fantastic life and can't point to any specific trauma or stressors or issues in their life. They just are depressed. And if you keep perpetuating the idea that it always has a certain cause, you know, that again leads to people thinking they can't be depressed because there's nothing to be depressed about. They just suck as a person, and that's also a very bad idea to internalize, and is not conducive to getting help at all. So that's another thing. Yeah, sorry, Nita, you were saying.
No, you're totally fine. Exactly what Corinne was saying. Like, I know even my parents still have a hard time with this. They're very supportive. I don't want to, if they ever watch this, I don't want them to be like, oh no. But a lot of the questions they asked me early on when I got diagnosed with anxiety was, well, why are you so anxious?
Right.
Well, I don't know. And like that question actually caused me more anxiety because it's like, crap, am I supposed to not? Because it's this idea that, oh, well, you can just stop being anxious. Like,
right.
Just, I've heard don't be nervous so many times growing up, and I would really like to never hear that phrase again, frankly.
Yeah. So what are you depressed about? Mm-hmm. And some people do have really bad clinical depression that comes out of situations, and then other people just have depression and just have anxiety disorders. And there are a variety of anxiety disorders. And both depression and anxiety manifest in very different ways. And just because someone doesn't have every single symptom that's in the DSM does not mean that they do not experience the world as a depressed person or as an anxious person. And the idea that, like, depression only counts if you can't get out of bed, that is really damaging. You know, I have been depressed and made it to work every day, and I've also been not depressed and not made it to work because I was too anxious. And, you know, I have gone to really big cons and been fine, and then I've gone to really small cons and not been fine because anxiety is not very good at following rules and predictions of what the constraints are going to be. And so when we tell someone, this is what anxiety looks like, or this is what depression looks like, it can be very undermining for people that have these issues but experience them differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
How Katie's anxiety manifests is not how my anxiety manifests.
It's going to be different for everybody. And also for different periods in your life. Like I mentioned, when I was a teenager, I was suicidal. And as an adult, I'm not, but my depression just manifests differently. And for a long time, I thought I wasn't depressed because I didn't feel the same way I did as a teenager. And even when I actually did struggle to get out of bed, and I would stay in bed until like 4 or 5 p.m., I was like, well, this isn't depression. I'm just being lazy because I don't feel like I want to end it, or I don't feel like crap, or I don't feel sad. I just felt really useless and worthless and empty, and so I was telling myself it couldn't be depression, and I actually had experience with depression myself, and this was even during the time that I worked on disability and Kit Lit, so I was pretty savvy about these things, and I was still telling myself, oh, but it's not that bad, and it's not depression, because that is, surprise, also one of the things that depression tells you is you don't have a reason to be depressed, and you're just making it up. So actually being honest about all these many, many different forms that other mental illnesses can take is so important, because otherwise people have this one set image in their heads, and anything that doesn't match it can't be depression, which is bad both for the people who have it, because they won't recognize it, won't acknowledge it, and won't seek help, and for other people, because then they won't acknowledge and respect it in the people with depression around them.
Right.
So yeah, more diverse portrayals.
And I saw that thing with the labels happen a lot in eating disordered communities, because the DSM-4, which is the old DSM now, people don't know that the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. It's the criteria for mental illnesses that mental health professionals use. The previous criteria for anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder were really strict, and you would see people trying to get the label, because if you didn't meet all of the criteria, you couldn't be diagnosed, and then your insurance wouldn't cover it, because American healthcare is the worst. So then you would see people getting sicker because they weren't considered anorexic until they hit a certain BMI, which is bullshit, by the way, and if they didn't lose their periods, which meant if you were a male-bodied person, you could never be diagnosed as anorexic according to the previous DSM, because you couldn't lose your period. You didn't have a period to lose. And that was like really, really horrible.
Yeah.
But you saw people saying, well, you're non-anorexic, you don't look anorexic, because there was this whole idea that was perpetuated by the psychology community and by diagnostics, saying you have to look a certain way, you have to meet this criteria, and it ended up with a lot of people who needed care and didn't get care because they didn't meet a certain criteria. So that the idea that someone has to meet a certain must have certain symptoms in order to get care hurts both at a personal level in terms of wanting to get care, but it can also hurt in a very real financial access to care way, at least in the United States. I don't know how it works in the Netherlands. In the United States, that idea is, that stigma and that ableism is so prevalent and so well ingrained in our healthcare society that it stops insurance companies, or it allows insurance companies to stop care. That's my little rant.
It's an important rant.
But why do you think there's such a stigma regarding neurodiversity and mental illnesses, whether in fiction or in general with everything, really?
I have thoughts on this, and it's kind of complicated, because
It is.
obviously I am very much in favor of talking about neurodiversity in all forms, and giving people the paths and tools to recognize it, to help themselves, to make sure that it is respected and taken seriously in general society, etc., etc. But at the same time, I can get very frustrated by attempts to do this, because a lot of people resort to comparisons with physical disabilities in order to make this point. Like, they will talk about why, is depression not taken as seriously as, for example, cancer. Like, if you have cancer, people will tell you, oh no, how terrible, get better. But if you have depression, people just tell you to snap out of it. But it doesn't work that way with any kind of physical condition. It's really not that simple. So many people with physical or visible conditions are still not taken seriously, are still not respected, are still told to snap out of it. And I just really hate the idea of pitting different conditions and disabilities against each other, because this is it's not a competition, and we shouldn't be like fighting over these scraps. Mm-hmm. We should be able to just talk about mental illness without trying to kind of like compete. And this is especially difficult for people who have both physical and mental conditions, because you'll be advocating for one part of you, and you see people bashing on the other part of you and having massive, massive misunderstandings of what that part is actually like. So do not do this thing. So with that minor rant out of the way, why is there such a stigma? I think because people really don't get it. because a lot of what these conditions have, like if I talk about autism, for example, and people ask me, okay, so what makes you autistic, or why do you think you're? I've had this question. Why do you think you're autistic? I'm like, I don't think it. I know it, and I don't need an official diagnosis to prove it, but I do have one. So please leave. But and the thing is that a lot of the things I list will be things that people are familiar with. They might recognize it in themselves or in other people, and that makes them think it's not as big of a deal. But the thing is that everybody has certain traits, but what makes it disability or a mental health condition is that these traits are A, constant, and B, severe enough to have a massive, massive impact on your life. If I talk about executive dysfunctioning problems, for example, which are a really huge deal for me, and like a major problem for me, having like the holy trifecta of depression, autism, and ADD, which all come with executive functioning problems, people will think like, oh yeah, I have that sometimes, and they will just interpret it like they had it because they were lazy, and therefore if I have that problem, it's because I am lazy and I just need to suck it up. And it's harder because they don't see or understand the barrier. Like if I have trouble getting out of bed, I know why that is. If they have trouble getting out of bed, they're like, okay, all they need to do is like swing one leg over the other and like get up. And they're like physical actions. And a lot of people who don't have experience with it just don't understand the mental disconnect and how those physical actions become near impossible. And it is really hard to explain because there's not a easily understood component. And for someone who's never experienced that, it's such an easy process. All of these things are easy. And it's just not, and sometimes there is no way to explain that. And I've met numerous people who were really clueless about mental illness and always told people to just suck it up and not be so lazy, etc., etc. And then they had it, and they were like, oh, I get it now, and it's really not that simple. So I think that is just one of the biggest parts. People don't understand it, and they just see little isolated parts that they recognize in themselves, so they think that those parts can be approached the same way, but that's just not how it works. Mm-hmm. And for the people wondering where Katie disappeared, it's not because she hates me. It's because she had to help her mom wrangle her cat into a cat carrier. It might be because she hates me, but that was the secondary to the cat carrier. Just so we've established. Donita.
Okay, so this is actually the last question, and I'm going to answer. I have to leave at 2:30 to go interpret for a deaf 3-year-old who is very, very adorable.
Everybody's leaving me.
I'll stay.
Anyway, I think to a lot of the stigma I end up seeing down here in the South is there's this very much this idea of, well, we don't talk about that. It's not talked about kind of down here, especially with the older generation. With my parents and stuff, it was just like there was this ideal down here that you keep your problems to yourself and you fix it yourself, and if you need help, you don't admit you need help, which is it's a very much a cultural thing down here, which in part, like it's generally I feel like an American cultural thing too, but Southern culture is its own kind of subset of secrecy and whatnot. So that's at least what I've seen down here, and I think too, like Corinne mentioned and Katie mentioned, because of the portrayals we see of mental illness, we think, oh, if it doesn't look like that, then you're not mentally ill. So there's this idea of being mentally ill enough to seek treatment or be diagnosed, and if you don't cross that threshold of being ill enough, well, then you're just faking it, or you're lazy, or etc., etc. Yes. Diana, can I say that?
Yes. Share it.
Yeah, Diana chatted it. You just need to do more exercise, which...
And take your vitamins.
Yes, take your vitamins. Don't
go out of your house, you would feel better.
Go to sleep earlier. Stop spending so much time in front of a screen.
Okay, that one's true for me, though. No, and big one, like just don't be so depressing. Just try to think positively. And like a lot of this is sort of true in like certain doses, but it's not that simple, and it should be like as a part of therapy and stuff. Because the problem with depression is that you don't have the tools you need to get out of your depression. Like you can know all the things that you need to do, but because you're depressed, you can't do it. So it's like this really. It's like the most dickish of all conditions, where it also stops you from being able to fix that condition. Which again, I hope that's not comparing, but it's a dickish condition. Okay, I'm not comparing. Sorry.
No, I found like exercise actually does help me, but at the same time, it does. It's not exercise by itself is not going to cure my anxiety. And when I had depression, for me it was like, well, my therapist was like, well, you could try exercising. I'm like, I don't feel like getting out of bed. How am I supposed to work up the energy to go to the gym?
And for me, like, exercise does help my depression, but it sets off my OCD and my eating disorder tendencies. So like it fixes one thing, and then I fixate on numbers, and then I have to go to the gym at the exact same time every day and do the exact same numbers and the exact same number of reps, and I get caught up in this whole other thing. So for me, it's not as easy as go get more exercise, healthier, because any of those things can trigger my other issues.
Yeah, and that touches on
place, like my neurons just argue with each other all the time.
Yeah, but that generally touches on how often these conditions do intersect with other conditions. Like, for me, everything is very intertwined. Like ADD and autism already have really high comorbidity rates, and they do interplay with each other in very interesting ways. But my depression and anxiety are also completely linked to this. Like, I do think my depression is somewhat situational, but not just like but I am way, way, way more vulnerable to this because of my autism and ADD. Like, it just, and especially like with anxiety, I get stuck in this spiral way faster because of the autism and the ADD. So they all interact with each other in interesting ways, and sometimes this is helpful because, like, I'm big on rules, and right now, what's helpful for me is having a schedule and getting out of bed at a certain time, going to bed at a certain time. I have several alarms on my phone that I need in order to eat meals at normal times, because otherwise I don't do that, and then I accidentally starve myself for a few months, which is not great. But that's actually really handy, because autism, you know what's great? Having a schedule and knowing what to expect. ADD, schedule, depression, schedule. So in that sense, it's actually semi-helpful. But sometimes it's just not. And can I go on a bit of a tangent now that's totally unrelated to the question?
Wait, let Nita introduce herself first.
Yeah,
sorry, go Nita. I don't want to keep you trapped.
Just a moment, Nita needs to go.
Yes.
Wait, bye guys, thank you for having me.
Bye, Nita.
Thank you.
Really nice to have you. Yay. And
Okay.
yeah, sorry. Right. And it can also just interact with other identities. Like, homosexuality used to be classified as a mental illness, and now it's not anymore, but people do still associate these things. So and a lot of people in the queer community have mental health problems, and this is used by the far right to see, like, oh, see, it's not a healthy lifestyle because they all have mental health problems. And things like that, it just doesn't quite work that way, obviously. And there's also huge intersectionality problem with race, and I really wish we had Heidi or someone else here who could talk about that with more nuance and authenticity than I can. But for example, what is a big problem is a lot of the police shootings of black people are specifically mentally ill black people. And because for white people, mental illness can definitely be misinterpreted, but for black people, the moment that you are somewhat unpredictable or unusual, it is immediately seen as a sign of aggression and a sign of danger. And I don't want to talk about this for too long, because I'm not the one you should be listening to, and there are a lot of really smart mentally ill Black people who are talking about this, so please go follow them. But that is something that is really, really important and should not be left out of these discussions. And just look at stigma-wise, like for what for some people can be the stigma of, oh, this is why they're dangerous, and it works differently, because like when you look at all the every time there's a shooting, if they're brown, it's a terrorist. If they're white, they're mentally ill, and this is really frustrating because it's gross on numerous ways, because it's both really, really racist and it's really, really ableist, because of this assumption that mental illness and violence are inherently linked, when mentally ill people are actually more likely to be the victims of violent crime than the perpetrators. And all of this is, yeah, it's intertwined, interplays with each other in really difficult ways, and sometimes in trying to untangle and deconstruct one part of it, you're accidentally reinforcing another. When, for example, a lot of people will talk about how, let me think, like how one condition doesn't necessarily mean that they're crazy or that they see voices or whatever, but then you're throwing people who do hear voices under the bus. Or you're saying like, oh, but depression, it's not like schizophrenia or something, but people with schizophrenia are also super marginalized and don't really need to be further marginalized by other mentally ill people. And distancing yourself from the scary or icky conditions really just does so much harm. So it's so important to just be like really broad thinking and inclusive, and making sure that by talking for one condition, you're not actually reinforcing all the harm and stigma to another.
I've seen that in books where someone says, oh, you're in love with that person, but isn't he depressed? He's always sad, or he's always whatever? And the person says, well, at least he's not schizophrenic. It's not like he hears. I've seen that.
That's disgusting. And yeah. I have seen something similar-ish like with a lot of conditions, and I've seen this in books featuring deaf protagonists, autistic protagonists, and others. They will be like, oh, people keep treating, and I'm going to use a slur here, so if you're, just as a warning, oh, it's not like I'm retarded or something.
Right. And
the fact that you are trying to defend your own identity as a disabled person at the cost of people who do have developmental delays, difficulties, is really, really not cool. And there's so many slurs that are still totally acceptable to use, or is even seen as comedic. The number of, like, Katie, you mentioned the word crazy earlier on, and that's still very stuck in my vocabulary as well, although I'm trying to get rid of it. But that is so commonly used and so casually used. And other words, psycho and psychopath, are super common, and people don't even see them as slurs or as in any way problematic. But lunatic is another one. They're just so ingrained in our language use because we have this automatic idea of these people are dangerous, and we don't even question that. Like, so often people will say like, oh, if someone is dangerous, oh, just put them in a mental institution because that's where we put these people. Like, we just want them out of our sight. And
out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, and it's just so terrifying that you're just stripping people of their humanity, and these are generally already the most vulnerable people in society.
Well, it's something that Kayla said yesterday on the diversity panel, is that we live and we have grown up in, and we've been indoctrinated by an ableist society. We're not aware of it. Even if we think, like, I'm a mentally ill person who just used the word crazy in my opening thing here. Like, it's so well ingrained in us as culture and society that we really have to listen and make the active steps to break that down.
And to know and recognize these terms.
Right. So, like, when a friend of mine says, hey, your book was great except for you use the word, don't use the word lame, I have to listen to that and say, oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, it did the character's speech was authentic to the time period, but that doesn't make it right.
Right, and so many people, by replicating this language use unconsciously, you're helping to further normalize it. If you don't question it in the text, you're just another, you're propping it up. You're keeping it as the default, the status quo, and you're making it acceptable. And, like, I have a friend who wrote a book, and I loved so much about the book, and then at one point I saw someone being described as, like, spastically waving their hands around. And I pointed this out to her, and I didn't even have to explain why it was a problem. She just paused and went, "Shit, I see what you mean." And she was super thoughtful about it and actually managed to get this fixed in the paperback version, which is great because publishers often don't really want changes made from hardback to paperback. But so much of this is just because you don't think about it. And there's a book that I mentioned yesterday, Hurt Go Happy, that a friend recommended to me, and I read it and I liked it a lot too. It's about a deaf girl, and that's the book that uses the R word. And there's absolutely no reason to do that. It was so completely unnecessary, and it makes it harder for me to recommend the book, because how can I recommend a book for good portrayal of disability when in fact it just portrays one condition well and completely throws developmentally disabled people under the bus?
Right.
And so I can recommend it, but with this, one condition. But that's the case for so many books that I'll use other words and other terms. And I know for like almost a fact, if I were to mention this to the author, she'd be like, "Oh shit, you're right," and would also want to change it. And in fact, I wish I'd read the book earlier because a 10th anniversary edition came out last year, and I'm like, crap. If I had mentioned this, maybe they would have changed it. And like, I'm not saying that I don't know. It was just a thought that occurred to me, and like I know so many people mean well and just don't stop to think about it at all. And that's I think one of the most frustrating things is they don't even realize it, and it would be so easy to fix in almost all cases. And sometimes it is necessary. Like if you write a book about ableism, sometimes you are going to need slurs, but most of the time in that case, the slur doesn't throw someone else under the bus, but it's actually an examination of how the main character experiences ableism, and 99% of the time, it's pointed out that it's wrong. It's pointed out, you see the harm it does on the main character. So I find that a somewhat different situation. Like, I'm not saying slurs can never be used, just as long as they're used thoughtfully. And there's also the problem of what if you internalize it? So many of the words we use actually are derived from disability. Katie mentioned lame as an example. There's also dumb, stupid, idiot, all of that. And I try to strip as much of that from my vocabulary as I can, but when I wrote On the Edge of Gone, that has an autistic protagonist, and it's a protagonist who's also very, very insecure and has often been told that she is unintelligent. And even if she hasn't been told this up front, a lot of people have made her believe this. And there is already, like, to get totally this the whole concept of intelligence is ableist, as is. There's no such thing as IQ, etc., etc. But in this particular case, she has internalized this idea, I am stupid. And so she uses that word a lot when she's like berating herself. And in my case, like, I don't think that, like, I was trying to be very conscious and only use it in this particular context. But the nature of the book made it so that I could maybe challenge like one part of it, but not like dismantle the whole idea of intelligence and the word stupid, etc. So sometimes it is complicated, and sometimes you do need to use certain words, but 90% of the time when you see these words used, that's not the case, and people just stuck it in without thinking about it. I went on for a really, really long time there. I'm so sorry.
No. Please keep going, really. Katie.
Yeah.
Katie, do you want to say something?
I think Corinne covered it.
Extensively. I'm sorry. I have so many thoughts. I can talk about this for hours, and there's so many nuances. And
Wait.
The problem is, I know I'm missing so much here in terms of nuance and intersectionality already. So
We're gonna have to get you a website.
Yeah, something like specifically about disability in children's literature. That would be great.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Call it disability in kid lit.
That's a great one.
That's a
It
good one.
is.
Diana, speaking of intelligence, is a genius.
Yes, obviously. I'm a Ravenclaw.
Ah, small guy.
But yes.
You're outnumbered, Corinne.
See, Katie at some point decided I was a Slytherin. I had no input on this whatsoever, but I'm going with it.
Definitely a Slytherin.
Okay. But all right. How do you think we can counteract this? The stigma, using slurs, people being disrespectful without meaning to.
I think we can do that by starting a website called, for example, Disability and Kid.
Good idea.
At length. Yeah, no, seriously, it is one of the big things. I'm currently working on a post that will go live next month, if all goes well, that's specifically about terminology, and that will will use a lot of examples and hopefully explain some of this to people. So I think for most people, like I said, they just don't know it. So making sure that they know it is the first step. And having this information out there, talking about it like we're doing now, talking about it on Twitter, talking about it on websites, whether it's Disability Kitlet or other websites, that I think makes all the difference. People are already becoming so much more aware of how complicated this stuff is and that they might need sensitivity readers. So I honestly think we're already well on our way, and I think the main step now is introducing nuance and, like, for example, what I just mentioned about comparing to physical disabilities. I still see this all the time, and once or twice when I pointed it out to people, they immediately understood where I was coming from and apologized and deleted it. And I don't mean that in a oh, look at how great or efficient I am. I mean that in a people genuinely don't know, and people genuinely want to learn, and people genuinely need well. So I actually have a lot of faith that it's going to get better. Not for everybody, because there's a lot of people who don't care or who aren't involved with the community. But I also think there's a lot of people who do care and who just need to know. And we're already well on our way, so I'm actually really optimistic.
I think that this ties into the idea of what I would like to see next in terms of literature. I think that books are one of the ways that we can reach who haven't had somebody to talk to about mental illness and neurodiversity in a safe way, giving them a framework to talk about something that they didn't previously have a framework for or didn't have the language for. And I think it's also a really good way to teach kids without being didactic, you know what I mean? To show kids who haven't had a personal experience with someone who has a neurodiverse condition or mental illnesses or anything like that, how to interact properly. There's a book called Play On by Michelle Smith, which is one of my favorite books in which the love interest has very, very severe depression, and the main character has to figure out boundaries for himself and how much he can get involved and when to call in parents and authorities and how to handle the fact that she's hospitalized. It's a really good book for learning what happens when your friend has depression and you don't. And then there are books for kids and teens who have depression. So I think that books give us a really good framework for going forward and for showing nuances of condition. So someone who has anxiety that isn't caused by anything, or has panic attacks that come out of the blue. Some people have panic attacks that are triggered, and some people don't have panic attacks that are triggered. People just have panic attacks. It'd be nice to see more of that in books. So I think that books are a really good way, or I shouldn't just say books. I would say that all types of literature, so including video games and graphic novels and comic books, short stories, interactive fiction, any type of fiction is a really positive way of moving forward and both changing the language that we're using and reducing stigma.
Final question. What are the books that you would recommend regarding neurodiversity, mental illnesses?
This is our favorite question.
This is our favorite question. I came prepared with props. Okay, so I will. There's a couple of books that I mentioned yesterday, so I will leave those out. But I highly recommend checking out yesterday's disability chat. I made a couple of recommendations in there.
Couple.
All right, so I won't repeat recommendations. Let me take a look. We've got Everything by Courtney Summers. Here's a specific example. This is not a test. It's about a depressed girl in the zombie apocalypse, because these survival stories don't often feature people who don't necessarily want to survive. But all her work is good, and most recently she has All the Rage, which deals with post-traumatic stress disorder, among other things. Ball Don't Lie by Matt de la Pena features a character with OCD. Katie's giving her official...
My official OCD thumbs up.
The official OCD thumbs up. Perfect. I do want to warn people that it is one of those cases where someone has internalized a lot of ableism, so the R word does appear on numerous occasions. So be character sensitive to that, but I thought it was such an important book, and it was super gripping, the voice is amazing, and I just like that you get to see like OCD from a poor teenage boy who freaking loves basketball, because it's like you don't see OCD very often as is, but definitely not in that demographic. The Whole Story of Half a Girl by, I hope I don't butcher the name, Vera Hiranandani. I butchered the name, I'm so sorry. It is a very cute middle grade novel, and the main character actually doesn't have any neurodiverse condition, but her father has depression. And I actually really liked how this was handled, because I thought the father was still a three-dimensional character. He had his ups, he had his downs, he was still, and at the end, it was treated very respectfully, and it was shown that he just really, really needed help, and that they couldn't fault him for suffering from this depression. And yeah, I liked how it was done. There's a couple of others that I don't have on me right now because I read them in digital art form or because I loaned them out to friends. One is Other Broken Things by Krista Desert, or Desart, I don't know how to pronounce that again. That's about a girl with alcoholism, which is again something you don't see very often in young adult fiction. So I'm so glad that we are seeing it, because a lot of teenagers do deal with alcoholism and other addiction issues. When Reason Breaks by Cindy R. Rodriguez is a great book about two girls who both have depression, and it manifests for them in very different ways. I'm going to leave Not Otherwise Specified to you, Katie. You also want Hunger?
No, you can talk about Hunger.
Okay, I haven't read Hunger, but we have a great review for it at Disability Kit. Hunger and Rage by Jackie Morse Kessler. It's a series about teenagers who are appointed as horsemen of the apocalypse, and they all deal with their own issues, and this is apparently dealt with in very thoughtful and interesting ways as it meshes with the paranormal aspect. I really need to read them also so I can talk about them somewhat more intelligently. Symptoms of Being Human by Jeff Garvin. I really, really like this portrayal of anxiety, and I've read several books with anxiety, and this was the one that I could relate most to, because there was one part where Riley is just walking through the hallway and having these thoughts rushing around their head, and I just felt like I was a teenager again, like walking around in high school and just trying to find a place to hide because I needed it, and yeah, it was so familiar to me, so I really love that one. Don't Touch by Rachel M. Wilson. This is an Own Voices book about a girl with OCD. I really liked how this was done too. And her OCD manifests in a very specific way, which is that she's not allowed to have skin-to-skin contact with anyone else because she thinks that will finalize the divorce of her parents. And this kind of magical thinking is also not something you very often see in novels of OCD, even though it is common. But normally when you see OCD, it's all about the hand washing or the counting, which might be common, but it's not the only thing. So I really like that this showed such a totally different way that it can manifest. Another one that I haven't read but that comes highly, highly recommended to me, is Francesco X. Stork's The Memory of Light, which came out this year, I believe, and which also deals with depression and a girl recovering after a suicide attempt. And then I'm going to, there's a couple of books that, yesterday I mentioned a couple of books featuring autistic main characters, so I'm not going to repeat those, but there are also books coming out soonish, I think all in spring 2017 that I'm excited about. Two of them are Own Voices young adult novels. Katie knows one of them. And the other is a middle grade novel about an autistic boy that I was actually a sensitivity reader for, and I loved it a lot. It's called A Boy Called That by Alana K. Arnold. It's not out until April, but it is available for pre-order, so I'm just throwing it out there. It was... yeah, I'm extremely, extremely, extremely picky when it comes to my autism rep, and I really love this one. So I'm very excited that's going to be out in the world. And I'm also going to just shamelessly hold up this one again because it is an Own Voices autism book.
Yes, I was going to speak about that one.
Okay, great. Yeah, yeah, it's about an autistic girl in the apocalypse, and it deals a lot with like how disabled people are devalued, and particularly in apocalyptic settings where it's all about survival and who gets to survive and who should survive. So, yeah, I'm totally shameless.
Really, really good.
It is, it is.
Really good.
Oh, see, I didn't even need to be shameless. You guys are doing it for me. Thank you. All right, sorry, I went on again, but Katie, all yours.
That's okay. So the book that comes out in the spring, I think it's a February release that Corinne mentioned that I had read, is an Own Voices book called Queens of Geek by Jen Wild. Highly, highly recommend this book. Absolutely loved every minute of it. It has an autistic girl who gets a romance. Like, so amazing.
And you were not all soulless automatons?
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Apparently to the world, but autistic girl gets a romance, and her best friend, who is bi, also gets a romance with a girl. It is Own Voices on many levels, and Jen's a really fantastic writer, and it takes place at a convention and fandom, and it's like just a wonderful, wonderful book. It's coming from Swoon Reads next year. Swoon Reads is doing a really amazing job with queer characters, by the way. We should definitely be supporting them because they've done an incredible job at getting a lot of queer characters out there. On to my other book recommendations. Not Otherwise Specified was on my list. Not Otherwise Specified is by Hannah Moskowitz. It's about a black bisexual bulimic girl. She's also a ballerina. There's a lot of B words in there. Etta is awesome. It's a really unusual voice. It's like stream of consciousness, but she pulls you right in. You see both her relationships with girls and guys on the page, and you see her wrestling with recovery as one of her friends from treatment is backsliding, and Etta doesn't want to backslide, and how that relationship works. So it is really good. It is also Own Voices in several ways, and I highly recommend that. The other one that I recommend is Every Last Word by Tamara Ireland Stone for OCD. One of my favorite things is that the girl who has OCD in this book is one of the super popular queen bees of her school, and she has purely obsessional OCD. And we often see people or characters with mental illnesses depicted as like the outsiders and the weird kids at their high school, and I think it's really important that we get to see characters who are popular and social and look like their life is together also having struggles with mental illness. So I really liked that book. Dr. Bird's Advice for Sad Poets is one of the best anxiety and depression books you will ever get your hands on. It is an Own Voices for depression and anxiety, has really good anxiety attacks portrayed, but to the point where I actually would put a trigger warning on it if you are easily triggered by reading anxiety. But it is a really fun book about a kid who has invents a pigeon therapist, essentially, for him. And Laurie Halse Anderson's The Impossible Knife of Memory is a really good book about a girl who is struggling with her veteran father's PTSD and the way that it affects their life. And I have had multiple friends whose parents have had PTSD or whose partners have PTSD from war, who said that it was really accurate and authentic to the point where it was painful. But all of Lori's books are really incredible. And then the last one that I'm going to recommend for tonight is Emery Lord's When We Collided, which I did a sensitivity read on, and it is a beautiful book about imperfect people and imperfect relationships that may or may not work out because of mental illness. It is definitely not a love cures all book. And I just really love that book, and I hope everyone picks it up. So that's it for me.
Thank you. Well, I was going to mention On the Edge of Gone, but, well, Corinne has one.
One addition to what I mentioned earlier, because I mentioned the 3 autism books, and we've now named 2 of them, so I want to name the third 2 because I feel bad. I haven't read this, but it is Own Voices, so I'm just going to go in with fate. It's by Rachel Lucas, and it's called The State of Grace, and it'll be out in 2017 by Macmillan. So I'm looking forward to reading that.
Excellent.
A lot. So, Queens of Geek, State of Grace, A Boy Called Bat. Keep an eye on those next year. Okay, sorry, Diana. You were talking about my book and how great it was.
Well, I was, because it's rare to see mental illnesses and neurodiversity in speculative fiction setting. And apocalypse or science fiction, fantasy, it's really rare to see it done, and very well done. So I think it's a very good example, and I loved it. So
thank you.
I have 2 adult fiction recommendations.
Okay.
Can I add those real quick?
Yes.
The first is Planetfall by Emma Newman, which is also a science fiction novel that involves, or science fantasy novel that has a character with anxiety and depression, and it was really, really well done. I really enjoyed that. And then the other one is, is it backwards for you?
No, it's working.
That's good. This is Strong Signal. It is a romance novel. It's male-male romance. One of the authors is bi, and both of the authors have some type of anxiety. This has one of the best portrayals of severe agoraphobia I've ever seen in a book. It was so, so well done, so compassionately done by the authors, and it poses a real obstacle, which agoraphobia does. So highly recommend this book in this series for great writing and really a sensitive portrayal of mental illness.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all for this panel. As always, you can ask us more questions on Twitter. Thank you, Corinne. Thank you, Katie, Anita, for being
Wherever
here.
you are.
And for speaking so amazingly about this. We have to stop this panel now, but we'll talk about research and world building next. So see you then, and thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.